So, welcome to the 2019 Thomas Hardy Society Study Day, which this year focuses on my favourite novel of all time, Far From the Madding Crowd. It's the first Hardy novel I ever read, back during my undergrad days about 500 years ago. I was instantly smitten, having already developed a love for Victorian literature. I suddenly knew that I had found the author for me. So, we're here to celebrate the 145th anniversary of the publication. The novel whose success allowed Hardy to give up architecture and devote himself full-time to writing. And it also gave him the income to finally be able to marry Emma Gifford after a long courtship, long distance of 4 years. In December 1874, the Spectator surmised that either George Eliot had written it or she had found her match. Hardy's delineation of character was divisive from the start. R.H. Hutton declared Sergeant Troy and Farmer Boldwood to be conceived and executed with very great power, while Henry James memorably stated that the only things we believe in are the sheep and the dogs. That's Henry James for you. In his 1914 study of Thomas Hardy, D.H. Lawrence summed up the novel quite succinctly as this. The unruly Bathsheba, almost pledged to Farmer Boldwood, a ravingly passionate middle-aged bachelor pretendant who has suddenly started in mad pursuit of some unreal conception of a woman, personified in Bathsheba, lightly runs off and marries Sergeant Troy, an illegitimate aristocrat, unscrupulous and yet sensitive in taking his pleasures. She loves Troy, he does not love her. All the time she is loved faithfully and persistently by the good Gabriel, who is like a dog that watches the bone and bides the time. Sergeant Troy treats Bathsheba badly, never loves her, though he is the only man in the book who knows anything about her. Her pride helps her to recover. Troy is killed by Boldwood, exit the unscrupulous but discriminative, almost cynical young soldier, and the middle-aged pursuer of the Fata Morgana. Enter the good, steady Gabriel, who marries Bathsheba because he will make her a good husband. That's D.H. Lawrence for you. It's a tale of sexual hypocrisy, female emancipation, and male insanity. My favourite character of all time is Boldwood. Just thought I'd put that out there. Yet it also contains passages of sparkling wit and humour, the rustics and the rural countryside being painted with the pen of a considerable artist, according to one contemporary critic. Today you will hear about movie adaptations of the novel, architecture, agricultural labour strikes, gargoyles, and a sympathetic response to the little written about Fanny Robin, among other things. And you will also have the pleasure of seeing a sneak preview by the new Hardy players of their dramatisation of the story, a taster of what to look forward to when they tour with the full production this summer. They're going to do a scene specially for us here today. So we hope you enjoy today's programme, which will end in a wine reception next door. Please do feel free to stay and enjoy. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Trish Ferguson is Senior Lecturer in English Literature at Liverpool Hope University. She's the author of Thomas Hardy's Legal Fictions and Maud Gone. She is the editor of Victorian Time, Technology Standardisation's Catastrophes, and co-editor of Victorian Fiction Beyond the Canon, and has a follow-up volume to Victorian Time forthcoming with Palgrave entitled Literature and Modern Time, Technology, Modernity, Glimpses of Eternity, Experiments with Time. Can I also say that when I finished my PhD in 2017, she was one of my Viva examiners. And she's actually a lovely lady anyway, and I have no idea what she thought of my more out there theories of Thomas Hardy and men, but she seemed to like it and I passed, so I don't mind. So without further ado, can I please present Trish Ferguson?
Thanks very much for such a generous introduction. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here today and lovely to see you all. So I'm delighted to be invited to speak on one of Hardy's most popular novels. It's had an enduring appeal since its first publication. When I was doing a little bit of work in the British Library recently, I was looking at Hardy's accounts and saw that it was one of the best-selling novels of his lifetime, alongside Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So I wasn't too surprised to see that, but I was more surprised to see it featuring as the 10th greatest love story of all time in the Guardian 2007 poll. And its ranking in this poll was a bit of a surprise. As I was thinking about it in my office, I looked up at this, which is an infographic. Which book of Hardy's has the most bleak events? And far from that, it is the most upbeat of Hardy's novels, but it still scores quite high for bleakness. We have a little key code to help us here. So we can see we have failed business, unrequited love, unhappy relationship, 2 deaths by accident/illness, and 1 murder. But it's in good company. So this is actually the top 10 of the top 20 2007 Guardian poll. There's quite a lot of bleakness here and quite a lot of tragic endings for lovers, as there is for 2 of the lovers in Far From the Madding Crowd. But it is, as Michael Milgate has stated, unmistakably a major work, a novel of astonishing confidence, richness and vitality. And I thought I'd like to look today at what makes this story such an important novel in Hardy's career, considering along the way the presence of death in this love story, and bearing in mind the context of Hardy's life when he wrote it. It was a novel that he began, as Tracy was saying, when he was preparing for marriage, but also when he was grieving the death of his mentor, Horace Moore. But also very much looking forward to married life with Emma Lavinia Gifford after the long courtship Tracy referred to. And the final chapters. Sure. Is that better? Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So the final chapters, he said, were written at a gallop. Is that okay? You hear me at the back? Yeah. Okay. So this confluence of circumstances may account for what we have in this novel, this kind of mixed mode. We have the pastoral, which was promised to his editor, Leslie Stephen. But it's also a form of elegy as well. And it also has some affiliation, as I'm going to be looking at, with the Graveyard School of Poetry as well. So its title is taken from Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, which is somewhat linked to that school of the Graveyard School of Poetry. So it's also, as I say, an elegy. It's recording a vanishing way of life, but it also shares the elegy's impetus to assert the primacy of life and the life of the author. And it shares this concern with the elegy's desire to have the author kind of asserting themselves and living beyond the dead. But it is also written under what I would suggest we might see as being the kind of anxiety of influence that we see Harold Bloom refer to. So it's the novel in which Hardy really asserts himself and establishes himself as the historian of Wessex, setting himself apart from contemporaries such as George Eliot. And he does so, I would suggest, particularly in what I see as a very Hardian chapter, which is The Gargoyle, Its Doings, which I've just plagiarised from Hardy for the title of my talk. So this scene that we have in the churchyard in The Gargoyle, Its Doings, brings into tension, I think, the concept of a kind of possible supernatural machinery behind the world, the kind of purblind doomsters of Hardy's conception of the world that we see in Hap, which he published by the time he wrote Far From the Madding Crowd. So it brings that kind of concept of this supernatural machinery into tension with the concept, I would suggest, of the idea of character being fate. So the churchyard scene in Far From the Madding Crowd plays a really important role in Hardy's examination of various different responses to living in a world that seems to betray us and oppose our desires. So I'll be exploring how we get this aspect of Hardy's modified version of pastoral. So it's beyond just dealing with kind of urban-rural contrast or class conflict that we might expect to get in the pastoral. But what we get here in this modified pastoral is, I suggest, a careful management of how we confront death in life, an examination of how we confront death. And what I'll suggest is that the introduction of the concept of Wessex, which Hardy introduced in this novel, is related not only to graveyard poetry, but also with the construction of a sense of kind of national identity as well, which I see forged in this novel through the pastoral mode. So responses to death that we see in the aftermath of this gargoyle scene, I would suggest, I think, proves to be kind of a test of Englishness, and as such is part of the ideological project that is the creation of Wessex. So commenting on Hardy's quotation, Far from the Madding Crowd, from Gray's Elegy, Michael Squires notes that the setting of the novel is an area remote from an urban world, much like the settings of traditional pastoral. And this is, of course, true. But Gray's Elegy has, as a whole, a lot deeper resonance, I think, with Hardy's work and with this novel, Far from the Madding Crowd, beyond just the phrase being adopted for the title. The ashes to flame motif in Gray's Elegy would have appealed to Hardy, as would the poem's related resistance to death and the attempt to effect a kind of reversal from death to life through memory and through writing. Gray's Elegy, like many elegies, revives the dead through presenting ideas and images of the dead as they were in life. Thus, the speaker presents us with the image of a housewife and her children by the blazing hearth, and the image of the labourer in the field at harvest. These images of life invoked in Gray's Elegy are in stark contrast with what lies beneath those rugged elms, suggested in the phrase, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap. Hardy was drawn to this particular line from Gray's poem and used it as a chapter heading in A Pair of Blue Eyes, in which Stephen Smith unwittingly courts Elfriede on the very tomb in which her former lover is laid, bringing the contrast between life and death starkly to our consciousness. And Hardy seems to have been fascinated by the idea of the proximity of death to a pair of lovers. And he illustrated such a scene for the poem Her Dilemma, published in Wessex Poems in 1898. Oh, sorry. So this is an architect's twist on the kind of cross-sectional thinking invited by Gray's Elegy when it invokes the image of a gravebed as a mouldering heap, a reminder of the putrefaction underfoot. That line from Gray's Elegy, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, brings us momentarily into the realm of the graveyard poets, whose meditations on mortality included reference to skulls and coffins, epitaphs and worms. In The Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva has defined our repulsion to such images as abjection. That which is abject, she writes, is at the border of my condition as a living being. The corpse, the most sickening of wastes, is a border, Kristeva writes, that has encroached upon everything. It is death infecting life. Death remains as a presence underfoot in Gray's Elegy, but it's intriguing to find how Gray manages that border that threatens to collapse the distinction between life and death. The voice of Gray's Elegy, as Anne Williams puts it, is that of a psyche persistently defending itself against intense emotions. Williams has observed that elegy written in a country churchyard is distinct from poems of the graveyard school, as Gray avoids any effort to express or arouse terror, the hallmark of the tradition he evokes. What we find instead, she says, is gentle nostalgia, poignant memories, and resignation. This is the modification of graveyard poetry through the pastoral, and we see a similar management of death in Hardy's novel that serves the purposes of this kind of pastoral ideology that we expect from Hardy and Far from the Madding Crowd, but like Gray's Elegy, I would suggest, also emerges from Hardy's psychic defences. As Hardy began writing Far from the Madding Crowd, Horace Moore tragically ended his life at his own hands on the 21st of September 1873 with the blade of a razor. Hardy was apprised of the details of the tragic death, the dripping of the blood heard by his brother, the final words, easy to die, love to mother. 4 days after Moore's death, Hardy went to Fordington churchyard and contemplated the mound of chalk dug from the newly prepared grave. The details of the death, too horrific to contemplate, Hardy records of this graveside visit. It was this day, rather than the day of the death or that of the funeral, which he attended and which he always remembered. Repressed details from the account of the death will emerge in Hardy's fiction. Troy's sword that will shave like a razor, the dripping blood on the ceiling viewed by Mrs. Brooks and Tess, even perhaps the tortured killing of the pig in Jude the Obscure with a blade. But they are details deflected, bound up with metaphor, defamiliarisation, or at least in very different contexts from suicide. What we see in Hardy may equate to Williams's assessment of Gray's elegy, the deployment of psychic defences, but these deflected images also show the persistent draw of what is abject on Hardy's imagination. Hardy tended not to write death scenes at their location in the narrative present, and often deflected attention away from death towards setting and to the aftermath of death, mirroring his insistence on remembering the visit to Moore's grave and not the day of death itself. But in Far from the Madding Crowd, such careful management of death is also embedded in the ideological project of the pastoral, and this involves the aesthetic management of death. It has long been acknowledged that Hardy offers a modified form of pastoral in Far from the Madding Crowd. However, while there are intermittent moments of realism that undermine the idealisation of country life, these gestures toward exploring the social reality of life in an enclave like Weatherbury ultimately collapse under the weight of the mode to which Hardy committed when he struck the deal with Leslie Stephen to write a pastoral tale for Cornhill. The fact that such gestures are subsumed into the larger purpose means that those moments of realism, the economic reality for the labouring class, the impact of the vagaries of the weather, class division, in fact, partake in the overall effect of the pastoral. So we can see the pointing to and deflection away from reality through the workings of the pastoral in a descriptive passage in the scene in which Fanny Robin completes her arduous journey to the workhouse, only to die there shortly afterwards in childbirth. So we see in this passage, Hardy equates the workhouse with a kind of a corpse. We have the reference to the winding sheet here. And in doing so, Hardy draws attention to the social reality of Fanny's death. And he also comments on the neighbouring earl enjoying the picturesque view afforded by the workhouse. In doing so, he points to individuals who are willfully blind to the reality of the workhouse as being equivalent to a deathbed. But this is an ugly reality, and this brief glimpse of the grim character of what was beneath is masked by the beauty of nature. So this kind of pointing to and deflecting away from is a technique of Hardy's modified pastoral that we see running throughout the novel, in which death and decay are transformed into the picturesque. So we can see how the sum total effect works culturally if we consider artistic representations of Hardy's Wessex. This is from Walter Tyndale's Wessex series of paintings from 1905, many of which are settings from Far from the Madding Crowd, and this one is the workhouse. So this image reflects the kind of cultural work carried out by the pastoral mode. This transformation of the reality of the scene to a kind of glossed version for middle-class consumption is a process with which the novel as a whole is complicit, like the ivy on the workhouse, which transforms it from a corpse into a work of art. So this is the kind of artistry behind the pastoral, and we see this throughout Far from the Madding Crowd. So while Hardy was conscious that he was writing a pastoral novel under the restrictions of serialisation in a prestigious family magazine, it's interesting to find that Far from the Madding Crowd, the 10th greatest love story of all time, includes a scene that had the potential to be the most grotesque scene in Hardy's fiction. When the heroine of the novel, Bathsheba Everdeen, receives the coffin of a servant, Fanny Robin, who'd worked on her farm before her death, she opens the coffin to have her suspicions confirmed that there are in fact two bodies instead of one. This is a scene that Hardy knew he would have to treat very carefully, not just in relation to the revelation of Troy's infidelity, but also in terms of just the aesthetics of the scene. And it's interesting to see how the pastoral manages such a scene by comparing it to a similar scene from Wuthering Heights, the greatest love story of all time. So, rather blithely, after Cathy's death, Heathcliff tells Zillah, "I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got the sexton, who was digging Linton's grave, to remove the earth off her coffin lid, and I opened it. I thought once I would have stayed there. When I saw her face again, it is hers yet. He had to work hard to stir me, but he said it would change if the air blew on it. And so I struck one side of the coffin loose and covered it up. Not Linton's side, damn him. I wish he'd been soldered in lead. And I bribed the sexton to pull it away when I'm laid there and slide mine out too. I'll have it made so. And then by the time Linton gets to us, he'll not know which is which. So Heathcliff is so consumed with love of Cathy that he fantasises about rotting alongside her corpse in this, the greatest love story of all time. In the 10th greatest love story of all time, there are no rotting bodies. Bathsheba opens Fanny's coffin, but what follows is a description that is, in fact, all the more tender for just how far it deviates from the grotesque. So rather than fetishising rotting remains, the scene is transformed into art. As Rosemary Morgan has discussed in detail, the coffin scene in Far from the Madding Crowd that was excised from Cornhill from the manuscript is highly aestheticised. So this is skillfully managed by deflecting attention from the flesh to hair throughout the novel. And one of the stages of revision of the novel built into this sort of build-up to the exposition scene in which Bathsheba recognises Fanny is to do with hair. Sergeant Troy is a hair collector and has acquired a lock from Fanny, quite possibly in the same manner in which we've seen him take a lock of hair from Bathsheba through the sword exercise. On seeing that Troy has kept a lock of Fanny's hair, Bathsheba says to Frank, "You shouldn't keep people's hair. You'll burn it, won't you, Frank?" Apart from her reaction, which is understandable, you shouldn't keep people's hair, the fact that Bathsheba asks Troy to burn the hair points to the fact that hair doesn't decay. And strangely, after Fanny's death, the lock of hair, now belonging to a corpse, which should perhaps invoke objection, is in fact fetishised by Troy. I'm not sure you can see that. We have the serial version from Cornhill and the revision, which I haven't referenced there and should have a check written there. So in the serial version of the novel, the identification of Fanny on account of her hair is followed by Bathsheba reflecting on Mosaic law as she contemplates her situation in this chapter entitled Fanny's Revenge. But in the volume edition of the novel, Hardy transforms the coffin scene from the potentially abject into the beautiful and the artistic. The hair provides a frame for this picture, and the narrator takes pains to emphasise that we're not in the realm of the grotesque, noting the youth and fairness of both the silent ones withdrew from the scene all associations of a repulsive kind. But furthermore, through the reference to Bellini in this reference, so he writes, "At last he had found the fellows of those marvellous hands and fingers which must have served as originals to Bellini." We have, like the lock of hair that won't decay, we have Fanny's corpse transformed into art that will be untouched by time. And this kind of sublimation was to become characteristic of Hardy's work, as when in Death the narrator comments that Eustasia's beauty finds an artistically happy background. And of course in the series of elegies that Hardy wrote after the death of his wife Emma. Likewise here, although we are told that experience had aged Fanny, in Death she is transformed into her younger self. Rather than being repelled, Troy tenderly kisses the corpse as one would kiss an infant asleep to avoid waking it. We are reminded here of the presence of the baby, also preserved as beautiful and given the dignity of association with timeless art, in the quotation from Charles Lamb's on an infant dying as soon as it's born. As Hardy describes the baby enclosed in Fanny's arms as a curious frame of nature's work, a floweret crushed in the bud. The tenderness of the description of the coffin scene is also all the more striking in that it is primarily focalised through the perspective of Fanny's rival in love, in fact her lover's wife, Bathsheba. And it is described as follows: neatly apparelled in its first and last outfit for earth, a miniature wrapping of white linen, with a face so delicately small in contour and substance that its cheeks and the plump backs of its little fists irresistibly reminded her, excited as she was, of the soft convexity of mushrooms on a dewy morning. While the coffin scene is devoid of any association with decay, as with the description of the workhouse, the idea of decay is transferred to setting. When Joseph Poorgrass journeys from Casterbridge to Weatherbury to collect Fanny's body, the fog, described as an atmospheric fungi with roots in the neighbouring sea, reaches out an invisible hand to envelop him. The coffin scene is followed by a curious act that reminds us that pestilence exists as an abstraction in the novel. While abjection is sublimated into art when the bodies are exposed, the context of the scene provokes an abject response in Bathsheba. Through Troy addressing Fanny's corpse as his wife in the sight of heaven, Michael Milgate notes that Fanny's unhappy death is transformed by Troy's declaration into a triumph for her and the most abject of defeats for Bathsheba. It is indeed an abject defeat, as Bathsheba is confronted with the reality that Troy rejects her, his living wife, in favour of a corpse. After viewing the bodies of Fanny and her baby, and seeing her husband tenderly kiss the corpse of his former lover, we are told that Bathsheba felt an impulse to flee from him, to run, hide, and escape his words, not stopping short of death itself. At this point, Bathsheba leaves her home and chooses to spend a night buried in rotting ground in a kind of death-like state of unconsciousness. The atmospheric fungi of the fog outside, in which Fanny's coffin was returned, lingers, and Bathsheba spends a troubled, sleepless night amid rot and decay. So again, we have the glossing over of the grotesque with the pastoral, with the morning mist from the light of the sun lighting up the beautiful yellowing ferns. But the swamp is indeed grotesque in the sense of being grotto-esque, rank with decay and pestilence. The narrator layers the description of the scene with images of rot to emphasise the death in life decay that surrounds Bathsheba in her grave-like bed. So this is a striking contrast in the scene between this and the serene and tenderly drawn picture of the coffin scene in which lie Fanny and her baby, whose cheeks and hands are fresh little mushrooms on a dewy morning, a description that is visually evocative without being offensive to the mind's eye. The description of Fanny's strikingly fresh deathbed is in contrast with the rotting leaves and fungi with clammy tops where Bathsheba lays her head in a kind of putrid grave. The earth exhaling a poisonous essence suggests miasma, and while the baby's hands were like rounded fresh little mushrooms, here the mushrooms are not only clammy, but described in terms that suggest bodily fluids, some with oozing gills, others with the redness of arterial blood. What we have here is the abject displaced from Fanny's coffin scene. That the grotesque and the abject are so strikingly absent from the coffin scene removes any taint of judgment of Fanny through pathetic fallacy. Instead, the atmosphere is pestilent when Joseph Poorgrass returns with the coffin. Again, as Howard Babb has observed, this symbolic scene featuring Bathsheba's burial shows the situation to be pestilent. We have pathetic fallacy here. The place is described as a depression. But furthermore, we see Bathsheba seek out the abject as an objective correlative to her morally rotten situation, bringing her to that borderland between life and death. This is reflected in the description of the mouldering heap in which she spends the night once she has confronted the abject. We are told the hollow seemed a nursery of pestilences great and small, in the immediate neighbourhood of comfort and health. And Bathsheba arose with a tremor at the thought of having passed the night on the brink of so dismal a place. Bathsheba has indeed been on the brink of a dismal place. Seeking out the abject has been a consideration of suicide. She confirms to Liddy that she might have been found dead after this point. She has reached the brink, that borderland between life and death. But this nursery of pestilences is in the immediate neighbourhood of comfort and health. And her retreat from the abject restores her to the pastoral mode. Bathsheba is not only awoken by birdsong, but by a young boy reciting prayer, and by the arrival of her maid, Liddy. Again, in this scene, the idea of rot has been transferred from bodies to setting. But again, the idea of rot is on the borderland, and Bathsheba can retreat from this place of death, from this rotting place associated with moral perfidy, to be restored to the church, the community, and to the natural agricultural world. Thus again, the grotesque is subsumed into the pastoral. Before the novel makes the transition from the grotesque to the pastoral, Hardy writes a scene that focuses on Troy and prepares for his elimination from the novel's ending. So here in the graveyard scene, where he visits Fanny's freshly dug grave, a potentially supernatural element is introduced at this point in this otherwise realist novel, and it is this, I would suggest, that makes the novel particularly Hardian. This is the introduction of what would come to be called in its various guises the imminent will, or the spirit ironic, a spirit that undermines human endeavour that we see in the gargoyle and its doings. Fanny has been buried in what is described as the reprobate's quarter of the graveyard of Wetherby churchyard, called in the parish Behind Church. In a sudden fit of remorse, Troy has erected a grand marble tombstone and carefully planted flowers all over the grave, which, in this Hardy novel, lies beneath the only still functional gargoyle of the 8 that feature on the 4 faces of the parapet of the church. Exhausted after his efforts, Troy spends the night asleep in the church and awakens to find that the rain has fallen steadily all night, and this has been concentrated through the mouth of the gargoyle onto Fanny's grave. George Eliot would never have written such a scene. This is distinctly Hardian. And here we have the bulbs anthropomorphized, brought to life, moving and writhing. And Hardy also introduces something of the bizarre in his description of the tawny mould. While the description of the hands and cheeks of the baby's corpse as mushrooms is an original metaphor, at once perfectly fitting and strangely tender, here we have the abject metaphor of chocolate mud. The scene is reminiscent of Hardy's poem, The Levelled Churchyard, when the exhumation of bodies to make way for a railway reveals the bodies all mixed up like human jam. In Fanny's grave scene, the movement visible in the grave with the writhing of the flowers almost suggests kind of the opening of the grave and offers a reminder of the proximity of the corpse. But nevertheless, the grotesquerie of this scene does not undermine the earlier tenderness of the description of Fanny and her baby in the coffin. It is the fact that Fanny and her baby are buried in the pauper's grave that has led to the introduction of this scene. So again, we have that element of the grotesque transferred from body to setting. And it is this that has led to this scene, which has the element of the grotesque, the fact of where they have been buried. And it seems that, in any case, Hardy can't write a scene describing anything kind of abject without some kind of pastoral revision. So, sentences after the passage featuring chocolate mud, Hardy writes the following very painterly version of the scene. So this pastoral kind of overwriting transforms the abject into something quite exquisite here before turning attention to the destruction wrought by the gargoyle and onto Troy's reaction. The scene featuring the gargoyle is more than just an event in Far from the Madding Crowd. As I've suggested above, it's related to Hardy's working out his conception of whether we're subject to a perhaps malign, perhaps indifferent, imminent will, or whether, in fact, character is fate. In this novel, Hardy wrote an extended description of the medieval gargoyles and the parapet of Wetherby Church, mirroring the extended narrative commentary that he writes on each of his chief characters. I'm not sure you can see that at the back. It's quite a long quotation. But it describes the history of these gargoyles and gives some detail about how hybrid they are, really. So much like Troy, who's introduced to the story as an exceptional being, the gargoyle that Hardy singles out as the one that concerns the story is of the boldest cut that the hand could shape and of the most original design that a human brain could conceive. The hybridity of the gargoyle is emphasised. It's not quite human, not quite animal, not quite griffin, not quite bird. And Troy's name, in fact, calls to mind the Trojan horse. The two of them really are like animal-machine hybrids, really. So the Trojan horse, like the monstrous water spout, is another kind of animal machine. So both Troy and the gargoyle are the destructive forces that seem very much out of place in their environment. But furthermore, the detail that the gargoyles are less like British than continental grotesques reminds us of Troy's origins. He is the illegitimate son of the English aristocracy and a French governess. We are reminded of his national hybridity in response to Fanny's death as he plants flowers on her grave. So it is suggested that Troy's over-sentimental response to Fanny's death is related to that fact of his otherness, as he, like the gargoyle, is a continental grotesque. We might also be reminded of that great Victorian elegy, Tennyson's In Memoriam, which likewise moves toward a pastoral ending, but not before documenting the realisation that grief can be overindulgent and isolating, the speaker comparing this to the blind hysterics of the Celt. We might even be reminded of Heathcliff's otherness when we consider his abject grief over Cathy. In any case, the narrative commentary points to Troy's grief as emphatically not English, and this is linked with his alienation from the agricultural world of Weatherbury. We see the same movement in Hardy's next major novel, The Return of the Native, which also eliminates all that is associated with France in the interests of preserving a pure Anglo-Saxon Wessex in its anomalous pastoral ending. Bonnie Gerard notes that if pastoral harmony can be thrown off key, then certainly someone is to blame. For Hardy, the scapegoat betokens the outside world. He is Sargent Troy. Gerard points to the reference to London in the scene featuring Troy, the soldier come farmer. But I think we go beyond that to see Troy actually associated with France in the gargoyle scene. While the gargoyle, like Troy, represents careless destruction, the narrative as a whole upholds the virtues of prudence and self-governance in response to fate. Troy planting bulbs on Fanny's grave is the most pastoral thing we see him do in the entire novel, and it's also the one act of his that shows long-term thinking. He chooses flower roots of several varieties, some to bloom in early spring and others for later seasons of the year. But when he sees the destruction wrought by the gargoyle, we are told he did not attempt to fill up the hole, replace the flowers, or do anything at all. He simply threw up his cards and forswore his game for that time and always. Notably, it is the joint work of Bathsheba and Oak that restores the grave. As they replant the bulbs, and Bathsheba orders that the churchwardens turn the leadwork at the mouth of the gargoyle so that the stream will, in future, be directed sideways and the repetition of the accident prevented. It is such a practical response to nature and to fate that will lead to their ultimate union in the novel's pastoral ending. For Hardy, infatuated though he was with Troy as an outsider, such is the weight of the mode of the pastoral that Troy must be sacrificed to serve the ideological purpose of the novel. Far from the Madding Crowd is a consciously intertextual novel. We see the influence of graveyard poetry in its title, but even more prominently, because on a structural level, we see the influence of the Georgic pastoral tradition, as Hardy writes a narrative modelled on Thomson's The Seasons or on the Shepherd's Calendar. There are references to literature within the novel that serve to distinguish characters belonging to the pastoral from outsiders like Troy, the novel's Trojan horse. Bathsheba and Oak are connected to the agricultural world through their reading material and their distinctly English book collections. It is notable that the restoration of Bathsheba to the pastoral element of the tale involves her reflecting on the books she has inherited from her uncle. Tongue-in-cheek, Liddy recommends to Bathsheba the story of the black man who murdered his wife Desdemona as a nice dismal one that would suit you excellent just now. This veiled allusion to the recent death of Fanny on account of Troy, which emphasises his otherness, speaks to the larger purpose of the narrative, to consolidate a sense of English national identity. After Fanny's death, Bathsheba asks for Edward Young's graveyard poem, Night Thoughts on Life, Death and Immortality. The moral of Night Thoughts is that virtue inheres in time being used, rather than time just being passed unconsciously. What the narrator has referred to as Troy's moral poverty is related to his attitude toward time, which places him at odds with his pastoral community. When he wishes to give away his watch, his only heirloom from his father, Bathsheba accuses him of recklessness, which is in stark contrast to Oak's prudence, linked with his ability to read the time from the stars. The virtue of using time properly in Night Thoughts reconciles us to nature and also to the idea of death. So Young writes, the man who consecrates his hours by vigorous effort and an honest aim, at once he draws the sting of life and death. He walks with nature and her paths are peace. So Bathsheba's reflections on her reading material, she ultimately favours the pastoral stories, Love in a Village and Maid of the Mill, reflect the shift over the course of the narrative through graveyard poetry back to the kind of Georgic tradition, literary forms that celebrate the agricultural world and laud stoicism in the face of death. We see the same shifting from graveyard to pastoral in Hardy's use of rustic characters. Ironic and even comic attitudes to death in the graveyard scene in Shakespeare's Hamlet, which Hardy was reading before he began Far from the Madding Crowd, are suggested in the counterpointing of comedy and tragedy in the scene featuring Joseph Poorgrass drink driving a hearse. But this is coupled with the stoic response, which we get prominently in Far from the Madding Crowd, and very much at a structural level as well. Through these intertextual allusions throughout the novel, through his depiction of the rural Wessex community, these people are stoic in the face of adversity and death. Through this, Hardy forges a sense of national identity. Thus, the episode involving the gargoyle in Far from the Madding Crowd and Hardy's reflections on contrasting attitudes toward death extend their reach beyond the individual and toward the national, from Weatherby to Wessex and, implicitly, England as a whole. What we see then, I suggest, in Far from the Madding Crowd is the sublimation of the abject into art that we see, partly on account of Hardy deploying his psychic defences. He repeatedly subsumes moments of realism and even moments of abjection into the pastoral, in what might, on some level, have been as a kind of paean to Moole, who had praised Under the Greenwood Tree for having the genuine air of the country breathing throughout it. But in Far from the Madding Crowd, Hardy is also developing his own understanding of the death drive and of responses to fate as he shaped his world of Wessex. It's not to be forgotten that Hardy is also, in this novel, aiming to be a good hand at a serial and interested in commercial success. Commissioned by Cornhill, Hardy was given an opportunity to write a serialised novel in a very prestigious magazine. Cornhill was based in the heart of London, but from its inception sought to bring the pastoral to an urban audience. So this is the cover of Cornhill, and the inaugural issue opened with a letter from its editor, then William Thackeray, which laid out that Cornhill would offer the harvest perennial from the kindly fruits of the earth. The cover design for Cornhill sentimentalised the rural, featuring 4 images: the figures of the ploughman, the sower, the reaper, and the thresher, figures that represent the seasons of the year. It's no surprise, then, that although Hardy had not yet written a word of his new story, he offered Leslie Stephen a pastoral tale as best suited to the Cornhill market. Serialisation offered Hardy a further opportunity to speak to Cornhill's thematic associations with agricultural time. He thus developed his pastoral story chronologically through the months of the year, corresponding with the months in which it was published, and all of the rural activities associated with the annual agricultural cycle, thus offering the harvest perennial, of which Thackeray wrote in the inaugural issue. As Cayley Enns has shown, seasonal images in Cornhill allude to the Georgic poetry of the 18th and early 19th centuries, introducing an implicit narrative of labour politics and British national identity to the periodical. In writing a pastoral novel suited to the thematic interests of Cornhill, Hardy was writing in an ideological mode from the knowledge base of one who knew the reality of agricultural life. But in writing for Cornhill, Hardy was writing for a magazine that offered, in Thackeray's words, the kindly fruits of the earth which grow for all. Hardy's ready adoption of the pastoral mode spoke to Cornhill's agenda to provide a class-aligning programme that linked literary production with agricultural production, all for the purpose of consolidating readers into a united readership. The inaugurative ode published in the first issue of Cornhill promised that the magazine would offer a genuine serial, punning in the word serial as corn and literary fiction. The poem goes on in the same metaphorical vein, building on the pun in the word cereal to separate wheat from chaff, much as we imagine Bathsheba doing here in the Corn Exchange. In the poem, genuine cereal is offered as an antidote for modernity. The poem opening with the line, "Ours is a faster, quicker age." Hardy offers such an antidote in Far from the Madding Crowd, alluding to the urban readers present as a faster, quicker age. In the oft-cited "The citizens then is the rustics now" passage. But Hardy goes further in using the theme of temporality as a means of consolidating a sense of Englishness. In this passage on the relativity of experiences of time, Weatherbury is favourably contrasted to London and Paris. And here he invokes this new moniker, Wessex, which is at once associated with continuity and rusticity. Thus he notes that this picture of today, in its frame of 400 years ago, did not produce that marked contrast between ancient and modern, which is implied by the contrast of date. Again, we have the distancing effect of relativity, with Hardy conceiving of a picture in its frame, but the barn and agricultural labour provides continuity. The central image here is the barn. Medieval gargoyles are at odds with humanity, but medieval barns are in harmony. Hardy was rewarded in reviews for his pastoral tale for providing a time-transcendent Wessex Arcadia, but also for eliminating class difference. As Andrew Lang's review suggests, the pastoralism of Hardy's Wessex Arcadia eliminates class difference and emphasises continuity with the past. Hardy thus achieves a continuity and a sort of cultural comradeship with Shakespeare and Chaucer. But it's not just a sense of connection with the past and a vertical axis that Hardy attains through Far From the Madding Crowd, but a comradeship that is implied to exist on a horizontal axis as well, so that the novel reaches for what Benedict Anderson refers to as the deep horizontal comradeship of nationalism. For Anderson, no more arresting emblem of nationalism exists than cenotaphs and tombs of unknown soldiers. Both Gray's Elegy and Far From the Madding Crowd are written from this vantage point of kind of memorialising the dead and considering what we leave behind for posterity. This is central to Hardy's conception of his task as an author, a task that he began to formulate in Far From the Madding Crowd. Hardy brings the anonymous rural labourer from the past to life, as does Gray, but while Gray's Elegy extends its reach from the individual to the community, Hardy's Elegy is for a vanishing way of life. His reference to his memorialisation of the partly real, partly dream country in his preface to Far From the Madding Crowd signal that it was in this novel in which he found his literary voice as the historian of Wessex, presenting an idealised England. Far From the Madding Crowd brings us to the borderland between life and death, as does Gray's Elegy, but the confrontation with death, dramatised through Oak losing his sheep, Bathsheba's night in a rotting gravebed, and ultimately Troy's response to the gargoyle, resolve the vacillation between Eros and Thanatos. Hardy's commitment to life is a commitment to his vocation as a writer in this novel, in which Wessex takes shape. The formation of Wessex, I would suggest, is, although a novelistic device, also a negotiation of poetic genres, an eclipse of the graveyard school with the Georgic, and ultimately the triumph of life over death. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. That was wonderful.